The morning in the luxurious mansion began, as always, perfectly. Sunlight gently poured through the tall panoramic windows, illuminating the spacious living room. Every detail of the interior testified to the wealth and taste of the owners. Expensive furniture made of dark wood, elegant paintings on the walls, antique vases, and sophisticated decorative accents. Everything looked perfect, without a single flaw. Mikhailo was sitting at a large table with a marble top, studying documents with concentration. He was in his mid-40s and looked exactly as one would imagine a successful businessman to be: fit, commanding, and smartly dressed. His expensive watch gleamed on his wrist, and his pressed suit fit perfectly. Elena was standing a few meters away from him, next to a wide window. She held a luxurious bouquet of white roses in her hands and carefully placed it in a crystal vase. Her look was impeccable, her long, wavy hair fell to her shoulders, and the light dress accentuated her slender figure. She looked like a real housewife, calm and harmonious. "Elena, do you remember that in the evening we received guests?" Mikhailo looked up from the documents and looked at his wife. "This is very important. Investors want to see how we live." Elena, not distracted from her work, smiled lightly. "Of course, my love. Everything is already organized. I took care of every detail. Menu, decor, entertainment, everything will be perfect." Mikhailo nodded with satisfaction, returning to the papers. "As always, I can count on you." She didn't answer, just continued to decorate the vase, but her hands were shaking a little. The moment of idle was spoiled by the quiet sound of the phone vibrating on the table next to her. Elena glanced at the screen out of the corner of her eye. A new message flashed on it. Her face remained calm, but her heart suddenly beat faster. She quickly took the phone before Mikhailo saw it. The message was short, but disturbing. "Tonight. We need to talk. I can't take this anymore." Her fingers gripped the phone tighter for a moment, and her face seemed paler for a second. She turned off the screen and put the phone back, taking a deep breath to calm herself. Elena was aware that she had to keep her appearance flawless. She raised her head, put her mask of confidence back on, and returned to her flowers as if nothing had happened. The sun continued to fill the room with light, but darkness was already beginning to accumulate inside Elena. She knew that this day could change everything. The evening in the luxurious mansion began with the brilliance and elegance that always impressed Mikhailo and Elena's guests. The house was filled with the noise of conversations, the light clinking of glasses and gentle music performed by an invited quartet. The spacious hall looked like a set for a movie. Crystal chandeliers twinkled with hundreds of reflections. Tables were set with fine china and silver, and a fireplace glowed in the living room. Elena, in an evening dress of champagne color, perfectly complemented this picture. Guests arrived one after another. Investors in expensive suits, Mikhailo's partners, who enthusiastically discussed his latest success in the diamond market, and Elena's acquaintances from artistic circles, who admired the design of the house, made according to her sketches. Everyone was delighted with the atmosphere of the holiday. Mikhailo confidently moved among the guests, exchanging handshakes, joking, and talking about his business. He looked like the real master of the situation. His every movement, every word showed strength and confidence. The guests listened to him with interest, nodding and admiring his stories about the international trade in diamonds, about special stones that he orders from the most remote corners of the world. Elena was next to her husband, as always, smiling and friendly. Her appearance was impeccable: perfect hair, sophisticated makeup, elegant jewelry that glittered on her neck and wrists. But under the mask of peace and harmony, there was tension. Her smile seemed strained from time to time, and her eyes kept drifting to the front door. It was as if she was waiting for something, or for someone. Finally, Oleg appeared among the newly arrived guests. He was an interior designer as well as a longtime family friend, and everyone knew that he was the one who helped create the unique style of this home. A tall, handsome man with an easygoing smile, he moved with the confidence of a man who not only knows what he's on his plate, but knows exactly what effect he's having on those around him. When Elena saw him, her heart skipped a beat. She tried to remain calm, but when their eyes met, a tension flashed between them that only a very observant person could notice. Their contact only lasted a few seconds, but it was enough to remind her of the messages she had received earlier that morning. Mikhailo, who did not notice anything unusual, gladly approached Oleg. He shook his hand and greeted him with the same warmth as always. "Oleg, finally, you are just in time. We are discussing the most interesting things. You have to see my new collection," Mikhailo said proudly. "Of course, with pleasure," answered Oleg, smiling. His voice sounded calm and relaxed, but there was a faint glint of something hidden in his eyes. Mikhailo invited him to go to the room where there was a safe with diamonds. Elena remained in the living room. Her face became a little paler. She clutched her champagne glass, trying not to attract attention. After taking a few sips, she stood by one of the huge windows, looking out into the night. Her gaze was absent, thoughts tearing at her insides. The music continued to play, the guests laughed and chatted, and the evening seemed as perfect as ever. But for Elena, this was the moment when the past began to intertwine with the present, and the tension in the air became more and more palpable. She knew that this evening was only the beginning of something that would change their lives forever. The night is in full swing. The atmosphere of the holiday has reached its climax. The guests gathered in a spacious hall where Mikhailo demonstrated the main pride of his collection, diamonds, which he ordered from the most distant corners of the world. Under the light of the crystal chandeliers, the stones sparkled with all the colors of the rainbow, causing admiration among the guests. Everyone present understood that these jewels are not just decorations, but symbols of wealth, power, and impeccable taste. Mikhailo, pleased with the attention, held one of the largest diamonds in his hands, a flawlessly cut stone the size of a quail egg. His eyes lit up with pride as he told the story of this treasure. The guests, holding glasses of champagne, listened attentively and nodded approvingly from time to time. Elena stood a little aside. Her face was as beautiful as ever, but those who looked closely could see the tension in her gaze. She held a glass of champagne with both hands as if it was the only thing keeping her balanced. Her eyes moved around the hall from time to time, but most often stopped at Oleg, who was standing among the guests, a little distant. He looked calm and confident, even too much for this evening. Suddenly, the peace was disturbed by the sharp sound of the doorbell. The guests turned, one of them even laughed, assuming that this was another latecomer. Mikhailo waved his hand to one of the workers to open the door. Elena, who was standing closer to the door, felt her heart suddenly beat faster. She didn't even realize why, but every cell in her body screamed of danger. The door opened, and in a moment silence filled the room as masked strangers appeared in the doorway. There were 5 of them, all dressed in dark clothes, armed to the teeth. One of them, obviously the leader, forced the employee to step aside with a sharp movement of his hand and took a step forward himself. "Everyone stand still!" boomed his voice, sharp and cold. Panic erupted in the hall. The guests frantically rushed in different directions, but 2 attackers quickly blocked the exits. The third closed the door, and the fourth pointed a gun at the people, forcing them to shut up. Only Mikhailo stood still, protecting the case with diamonds. His face was stony, but his eyes blazed with rage. "We know what we want," the leader continued, "and we won't leave without it. Case, immediately." Mikhailo took a step back, tightly pressing the case to his chest. "You don't understand who you've contacted," he said through gritted teeth. "These diamonds are worth more than your life." The leader laughed, short and mocking. "And you don't understand who you contacted, Mr. Rogov. You will do as I say, or your dear guests will go home, not in limousines, but in black bags." Elena was standing in a corner. Her face was pale, and her body seemed paralyzed by fear, but her eyes carefully watched everything that was happening. They stopped at Oleg, who was standing a little far away. His face showed no trace of panic. He didn't even look scared. It was strange, even suspicious. Something about his composure seemed off. Elena felt something inside her go cold. Her thoughts were confused, but one thing was clear. What was happening now was not just a coincidence. The leader of the gang turned to Mikhailo again, taking a step closer. "You have a choice. Either we take the stones and you stay alive, or everything will end very badly. And for you, and for her." He sharply nodded in Elena's direction. Mikhailo glanced briefly at his wife. His fists clenched. He couldn't let anything happen to her, but he also knew These diamonds are not just money. They are his reputation, his life. The tension in the hall was becoming unbearable. Everyone was silent, waiting for what would happen next. Olena continued to look at Oleg. Her fear was replaced by a hunch that began to form in her mind, but she did not yet dare to accept it. Mikhailo remained where he was, clutching the case of diamonds, as if that were the only thing that mattered. His posture radiated stubbornness, but his eyes showed that he understood how dangerous the situation was. The criminal in front of him took a step forward, holding his gun so that everyone could see that he was not joking. "I won't repeat it twice," said the leader of the gang in a voice that made the blood run cold. "Give me the case, or one of your guests will pay." A muffled sob echoed from the hall. One of the guests, a young girl, could not stand the tension and burst into tears. Her husband tried to calm her down by whispering, but that only attracted the attention of one of the attackers. He pointed a weapon at them. "Quiet," he growled, and all the sounds in the hall instantly died down. Olena turned her gaze from her husband to Oleg. He stood as if watching, his arms crossed over his chest, his face showing neither fear nor excitement. Her suspicions grew. "Why is he so calm?" she thought, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, one of the attackers came closer to Elena. She instinctively stepped back, her back against the cold wall. "And you, doll," he said in a rough voice, leaning closer. "You know how to convince your husband, don't you?" His hand reached for her, but at that moment, Mikhailo took a step forward. "Let her go," he shouted, and his voice sounded like real rage. "I will give you what you want, but leave the guests and my wife alone." The leader of the gang raised his hand, signaling his men to stop. They instantly froze, but did not lower their weapons. He carefully looked at Mikhail as if assessing how far he was ready to go. "A wise decision," said the leader, smiling wryly. "But you don't dictate the terms. Case here, and quickly." Mikhailo slowly bent down, placing the case on the floor. His hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. One of the attackers picked up the case and carried it to the leader. He opened it, examined the diamonds, and nodded with satisfaction. "Okay, guys, time to go," said the leader, closing the case. It seemed that everything was over. But at the moment when the attackers began to retreat, the situation changed dramatically. One of the guests, a young man who must have been more brave than intelligent, rushed forward, trying to wrest the weapon from one of the assailants. This caused chaos. Shots rang out. The guests started screaming, hiding behind the furniture. Elena fell to the floor, covering her head with her hands. She heard Mikhailo shouting something, but she couldn't make out the meaning. The whole situation turned into chaos. In the midst of this chaos, Olena suddenly saw Oleg calmly leave the crowd and head towards one of the attackers. His movements were confident, and his gaze was cold. He whispered something in his ear, and the attacker, instead of stopping him, stepped aside. "What's going on?" thought Elena, unable to believe her eyes. She could not help but notice that Oleg acted as if he knew these people. He was not afraid of them. Moreover, they listened to him. Gradually, the chaos began to subside. The attackers retreated, taking the diamonds. They disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind broken glasses, scattered furniture, and shocked guests. Elena rose to her feet. Her body was trembling. She looked at Mikhailo, who was hugging a guest, trying to calm her down. Then her gaze stopped at Oleg. He stood in the corner, calm and unmoved, as if nothing had happened. "He's hiding something," flashed through Elena's mind, and she decided that she would definitely find out what it was. After the attackers disappeared, a tense silence enveloped the house. The guests, frightened and confused, began to slowly come out of their hiding places. Someone was helping others up. Someone was sitting on the floor, staring into the void. Mikhailo quickly turned to his wife, his face full of concern. "Are you healthy?" he asked, carefully examining Elena. "Yes," she answered quietly, her voice trembling. "And you?" "It's all right," he answered shortly, then glanced at the staff. "Call the police, and immediately." While Mikhailo tried to calm the guests down, Olena turned her gaze to Oleg. He stood aside with his arms crossed, his face still. This calmness of his infuriated her. She came closer, clenching her fists. "Oleg," she said sharply. "What was that? Why did they listen to you? Did you know these people?" Oleg raised his eyebrows, as if surprised by her accusation, and slowly shook his head. Elena, are you serious? I have nothing to do with what happened. I myself am no less scared than you. No less? Elena broke off at the cry. You stood there as if nothing had happened. They backed off when you said something to them. Explain it. I didn't tell them anything, answered Oleg. His voice remained calm, but a little harsh. Maybe you were just nervous. This is normal in such a situation. Mikhailo came closer, hearing raised tones. His face was gloomy, but he kept his composure. What is happening here? He asked, looking sometimes at his wife, then at Oleg. I just want to know why Oleg acted as if he was part of it, Olena answered sharply. It's absurd, Oleg sighed, spreading his hands. Mikhailo, you know me. Do I look like someone who could participate in a robbery? I didn't even know you had diamonds stored here until you mentioned them yourself. Mikhailo looked carefully at Oleg. He seemed to be debating whether to trust his old friend. Olena, you must be just shocked, he said, turning to his wife. Oleg could not be involved. We have known him for years. Do we know? Elena asked indignantly. What if we were wrong? Did you see how he behaved? How did he speak to them? Oleg took a step forward. His face became more serious. Listen, Elena, I understand that you are scared, but to accuse me of something without evidence is unfair. If I were a part of it, I wouldn't be risking my life to stay here with you. Think logically. Elena looked away, her face burning with emotion. She wanted to say something, but she was at a loss for words. Meanwhile, the police had already arrived, and the situation began to return to relative order. Oleg held himself confidently, but Elena felt that something was wrong. She looked at him and understood, even if he denied his involvement, her suspicions would not go away. And now she decided to act on her own to find out the truth. Elena could not get rid of the guilt for her harsh words to Oleg that evening. After much thought and days of silence, she decided to write to him. Her message was short but telling, I'm sorry, can we talk? Oleg answered quickly, Of course, tell me when and where. They agreed to meet in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, away from acquaintances and random witnesses. When Olena arrived, Oleg was already waiting for her at the table by the window. He looked calm and confident, but there was something else in his gaze, a slight hint of resentment. Hello, she said, sitting across from him. Thank you for coming. Hello, answered Oleg, carefully looking at her. I couldn't help but come. But to be honest, I didn't expect you to want to talk to me after what you said. Elena looked away, feeling her cheeks burn. I know I've been unfair to you, she began. But you have to understand there was chaos then, and I just didn't know who to believe. And now? Oleg asked calmly. She looked him straight in the eyes. Now I believe you. You are not involved in that robbery. Sorry for doubting. Oleg nodded, his face softened a little. Thank you, he said. I'm glad you understood that. But you should know. That evening was terrible, not only for you. It shocked me too, and your accusations, they hurt. Elena sighed quietly. I understand, I'm really sorry. Oleg and Elena continued to meet secretly, although their romance had been going on for several years. They skillfully hid their relationship from everyone, even from Mikhail himself, who trusted both of them without question. But after the robbery, the situation became more tense, and Elena doubted Oleg for a moment. Her doubts worried them both, but he knew how to win her trust back. I'm not involved in this, Elena, he said when they met in his apartment, which had long been their refuge. His voice was calm, but serious. You must understand that. I would never put you in danger. She sat opposite, holding a glass of wine, and listened intently. Her gaze was intense, but it no longer held the deep distrust that had appeared after the robbery. I believe you, Oleg, she finally said, putting the glass down on the table. I'm just scared. It all happened so suddenly, and I didn't know what to think. I know, he stepped closer, gently taking her hand, but you have to trust me. I will always be by your side. That will never change. These words calmed her down. Elena was silent for a long time, looking at him, and then she sighed and laid her head on his shoulder. She was fine with him. Here, in his apartment, away from the prying eyes of others, she could be herself. Their meetings became even more cautious. They chose quiet places where no one could see them and avoided too long conversations in public. Every moment spent together was a risk for them, but they could not stop. Mikhailo did not notice anything. He was too busy rebuilding the business after the robbery, constantly negotiating with investors and planning new deals. Elena used this to break out of the house and meet Oleg. After the wave of suspicions on the part of Elena subsided, Oleg returned to his game again. He has always been a master of manipulation, and this situation was no exception. He convinced Elena of his innocence, but deep down he knew that the real truth could destroy everything they had. One late evening, when Elena was at home with Mikhailo, Oleg met with the attackers in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He drove there in his car, turned off the headlights, and stopped at an old metal door. Two men in dark clothes were already waiting for him inside, their faces hidden in the shadows. "You're a little late," said one of them, a tall man with a gruff voice. It was the same voice that commanded the entire operation that evening. "I had my own business," answered Oleg calmly, closing the door behind him. "Now let's get down to business, my share." The man smirked and nodded to his partner. He took out a small metal case and put it on the table. Oleg opened it and saw several large diamonds that sparkled in the weak light of the lamp. "Is that all?" Oleg asked, raising his eyebrows. "This is your share," the leader replied coldly. "We did everything as agreed. You gave us information about the time and place. We took the diamonds. If that's not enough for you, then that's your problem." Oleg looked carefully at the men, his eyes narrowed. "That's enough for me. But remember, if anyone finds out I was involved, you'll have to deal with me." "Nobody will find out," said the leader. "Unless, of course, you do something stupid." Oleg closed the case and took it with him. His heart was pounding, but his face remained coldly calm. He left the warehouse, got into the car, and drove off into the night. It was clear to him that the game was becoming more and more dangerous. Returning to his apartment, he opened the case and took another look at the loot. These diamonds meant more than just money. This was his chance to escape from the status of Mikhail's shadow, from his control. He had long planned to move away from this dangerous game with his spouse, and these stones could be the beginning of a new life. Elena knew nothing about this side of his life. She believed in his innocence and loved him, not knowing how involved he was in the dark side of that terrible night. But Oleg understood. If the truth came to the surface, everything they had would collapse like a house of cards. His plan was simple: close the deal, sell the diamonds, and disappear forever. But little did he know that fate had plans of its own, and the secrets he had been hiding were about to begin to destroy his perfectly constructed lie. The following days turned into a game of hide and seek for Oleg. He acted cautiously, avoiding anything that might reveal his involvement in the robbery. However, with each step he realized that the risks were increasing. The attackers were not the kind of people you could completely trust. Their promises of silence could disappear in an instant as soon as it was convenient for them. Elena, not suspecting anything, continued to secretly meet with Oleg. Her feelings grew stronger, and she wondered more and more about how long she could live a double life. Her feelings for Mikhail faded long ago, but with Oleg she felt real passion, but the fear of exposure oppressed her. One evening, when they met in his apartment, Olena noticed that Oleg looked tense. "Did something happen?" she asked, sitting down on the couch next to him. Oleg looked thoughtfully out the window, holding a glass of wine in his hand. He was silent for a few seconds and then answered, "No, everything is fine, just a little tired." Elena leaned towards him, carefully placing her hand on his shoulder. "You can trust me," she said quietly. "If something is wrong, just say." Oleg looked at her. His eyes were full of emotions. For a moment, he thought he could tell her everything, confess that he had helped the attackers plan this robbery. But he knew it would ruin everything. Their relationship, her trust, her feelings, everything will be lost. "I trust you, Elena," he finally said, taking her hand. "But this is not the time to talk about my problems. The main thing is that I have you." Her heart sank. She saw something more than just tiredness in his eyes, but decided not to press it. Instead, she ran her fingers over his face and snuggled into him, seeking the peace she so desperately needed in his arms. Meanwhile, Mikhailo had suspicions. He began to notice changes in Elena's behavior, her absence at home, short and vague explanations. She became more withdrawn and her gaze sometimes seemed absent. He chalked it up to post-robbery stress, but his intuition told him there was more to it. Mikhailo began to act. He decided to check Elena. He hired a private detective to follow her. A few days later, the detective brought the first results, photos of her meetings with Oleg. They were made from afar, but it was enough for Mikhailo to put everything into a single picture. His anger was almost out of control, but he didn't want to act impulsively. He understood that a simple quarrel would not do. He needed a plan, a way to punish Oleg and Elena at the same time, as well as regain control of the situation. Mikhailo decided to wait, waiting for the moment when the truth will surface in the most painful way for both. And this moment was already closer than they could imagine. Mikhailo was calm on the outside, but emotions were raging inside. He was not only a betrayed husband, but also a man who could not stand being played against him, especially close people. His patience was only part of a larger plan, a plan to end this betrayal and restore his power. One evening, Olena returned home after another meeting with Oleg. She tried to look casual, but Mikhailo already knew where she was and with whom. He met her in the living room, sitting calmly in a chair with a glass of whiskey in her hands. "How was the meeting with your friend?" he asked, with a hint in his voice, not looking up from his drink. Elena froze for a moment, but quickly recovered. "Okay," she replied, trying to avoid direct gaze. "We talked a little, drank coffee. And how are you? How was your day?" "Not bad," he said, finally looking at her. His gaze was cold, penetrating. "I also met interesting people today." Elena felt the tension growing, but did not elaborate. She hurried to the bedroom, trying to avoid a long conversation. Meanwhile, Mikhailo began to act. He met with one of his contacts, an influential businessman who had connections in criminal circles. Mikhailo not only wanted to punish Elena and Oleg, but also to solve the issue with the diamonds that were stolen during the robbery. He was convinced that Oleg had something to do with it. Information from the detective only strengthened his suspicions. Oleg, meanwhile, was playing a dangerous game. After receiving his share of diamonds, he tried to find a buyer to sell them as soon as possible. But the people he contacted were just as dangerous as the attackers he worked with. Meetings in shadowy circles became a part of his everyday life, and he understood that it was only a matter of time before the threads began to unravel. During one of these meetings, the leader of the gang with whom Oleg worked began to ask questions. "Oleg," he said, looking at him intently, "you don't think you can just quit the game, do you?" "We agreed," answered Oleg coldly, holding himself in his hands. "You got your share, I got mine. Everyone is satisfied." "Did you agree?" The leader of the gang smiled, but there was nothing good in his smile. "You forget that we risked our lives, and you just gave us information. Maybe your share was a little too big?" Oleg felt the tension rising. His heart began to beat faster, but he didn't let it show on his face. "You have everything you wanted. If you decide to change something, I can also find ways to make your lives more difficult." The leader leaned closer, his eyes hard. "Don't forget who you are talking to." Mikhailo, meanwhile, prepared a trap. He learned that Oleg was planning a meeting with one of the diamond buyers and decided to act. Due to his connections, he arranged for the police and representatives of criminal circles, who had long been looking for an opportunity to catch Oleg, to unexpectedly rush to this meeting. Elena, not suspecting anything, continued to meet with Oleg, but during their next date at his apartment, she noticed how his behavior became more nervous. "What happened?" she asked, looking at him. "Nothing," he answered quickly, but his voice was strained. "It's just a lot of work." Elena felt that something was wrong, but decided not to press. She did not know that in a few days everything would come out, and her life would change forever. Mikhailo patiently waited for the moment when his plan would work and all the masks would be torn off. His revenge was closer than Oleg and Elena could imagine. In the following days, the tension between all three grew invisibly. Elena and Oleg continued to meet, although both felt that the situation was about to explode. Oleg, who plunged deeper and deeper into a dangerous game with diamonds, kept his plans a secret even from her. He felt that he was getting close to the edge, but he hoped to resolve everything quickly and without unnecessary complications. Mikhailo, meanwhile, watched. He already knew enough to understand. Oleg is not just his wife's lover, but also has a connection to robbery. Detectives confirmed that Oleg was in contact with the attackers, and the fact that the diamonds have not yet been found led Mikhail to think that Oleg could keep part of the loot for himself. One day, Mikhailo received a message from his contacts that Oleg had arranged a meeting with a potential diamond buyer. He decided that this was the perfect moment to act. Oleg was standing in an abandoned warehouse, waiting for a buyer. On the table in front of him lay a case of diamonds. His appearance was calm on the outside, but inside he was seething with tension. The man with whom he was supposed to meet was known in shady circles as a mediator, and Oleg knew that a deal with him was a big risk. The warehouse door creaked, and a stocky man entered with 2 bodyguards. His movements were confident, his gaze penetrating. "Is this the product?" he asked, nodding at the case. "Look for yourself," answered Oleg, feeling his heart beating in his chest. The broker opened the case and carefully examined the diamonds for a few seconds. He nodded, satisfied. But just at that moment, the doors of the warehouse suddenly opened. People in civilian clothes entered and immediately drew their weapons. Behind them is a group of armed criminals who were competitors of the attackers. "No one should move," came the voice of one of them. Oleg froze when he realized that this was not just a police operation. His gaze quickly ran around the room, but there was no way out. The mediator, without losing his composure, closed the case and took a step back. "You seem to be in trouble, my friend," he said, looking at Oleg. In the ensuing chaos, Oleg tried to escape, but was caught. His hands were twisted and he was placed on a chair. It was at this moment that Mikhailo appeared at the door. "You thought you could fool me, didn't you?" he said, coming closer. His voice was icy. "First you stole diamonds from me, then you stole my wife, but now everything will end." Oleg was silent. He knew that any words would be useless now. He looked at Mikhail, but there was neither remorse nor fear in his eyes. "You knew you were going to lose anyway," Mikhailo added, crossing his arms over his chest. "And now you will see how it looks." The same evening, Elena was called to the police station. Her heart sank with fear. She did not understand what was happening. When she arrived, she was met by Mikhailo. His face was cold, his eyes merciless. "Why are you here?" she asked, not understanding what was happening. "It's all over, Elena," he said. "Oleg has been exposed. He was part of that robbery, and you were his accomplice without even realizing it." Elena lost the gift of speech. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "That's not true," she whispered. "He couldn't—" "He could and did," Mikhailo interrupted, "and you were naive enough to believe him." Mikhailo was sitting in his huge living room. An empty glass of whiskey was on the table in front of him. Everything around remained as impeccable as always. Luxurious furniture, exquisite paintings, expensive decor. But the atmosphere was filled with anger and frustration. Elena was standing by the door. Her face was pale. Her hands were clutching her bag. She knew this moment would come, but it was impossible to prepare for it. Mikhailo was calm on the outside, but his eyes gave off a real storm. "You won't even try to justify yourself?" he said in a low but icy voice. "Not a word?" Elena sighed. Her voice trembled. "Mikhailo, I know I made a mistake, but I didn't want everything to be like that. It didn't happen the way you think." "Not as I think?" Mikhailo stood up sharply. His voice rose. "Elena, I know everything. I saw you with him. I know he was involved in the robbery, and you believed him even when I did everything to protect us both." "I didn't know," she whispered. "I did not know that he was involved in this." "It doesn't matter anymore." Mikhailo waved his hand as if pushing her words away. "You betrayed me. Everything else is just details." Elena tried to come closer, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "No need," he said sternly. "I don't want to listen to your excuses. You have an hour to pack your things and get out of here. This house is no longer yours." She froze, not believing her ears. "Mikhail," she began to plead, "we can fix it. I made a mistake, but I was confused. Give me a chance to change everything." "Chance?" he smiled sarcastically. "Chance of what? To pretend to be a happy man again while you run to another behind my back? No, Elena, everything is over." He turned to the door and called the housekeeper. "Help the lady pack," he said shortly, "and make sure she doesn't come back." Elena realized that it was useless to argue. She quietly lowered her head and moved to the bedroom to gather her things. Every step felt heavy, and tears streamed down her face, leaving traces of remorse and pain. When she came out with a suitcase in her hands, Mikhailo did not even look in her direction. His coldness broke her more than any screams. She stopped at the door and said quietly, "I'm sorry, Mikhailo. I'm sorry for everything." He didn't answer. Her words hung in the air like the last echo of her presence in this house. Elena went out and closed the door behind her, feeling that she was leaving a part of herself with this house. He sat in his chair, looking at the glass that he never refilled. Revenge was done, but all he felt was emptiness. His opulent home, once full of life, now seemed like a soulless trap. After some time, Mikhailo found peace after the chaos that turned his life upside down. He was not looking for a new relationship right away, but fate brought him together with Anna, a simple but sincere woman who worked in one of his charities. Her caring and honesty gradually melted the ice in his heart. Anna did not seek luxury or gain. She appreciated simple things: evening walks, conversations, and mutual support. It was a new experience for Mikhailo. He realized that true happiness does not depend on wealth or status, but on honesty and trust. A year later, they got married in a modest ceremony, and for the first time in a long time, Mikhailo felt that his home was filled with warmth and love. After Mikhailo kicked Elena out, she had neither a place to live nor enough money to start a new life. She turned to her acquaintances, but most of them turned their backs on her. Her relationship with Oleg, who was convicted of robbery, became a disgrace, and people avoided any relationship with her. At first, she tried to rent a small room with the savings that still remained, but the money quickly ran out. After several months of wandering, Olena ended up on the street. Her once graceful face was tarnished with dirt and fatigue, and her eyes, which had shone with confidence, were now filled with emptiness. Sometimes she passed by the huge house that was once her home, watching from afar how Mikhailo and his new wife spent time together. In the yard, she saw children playing, and their sonorous voices pierced her soul. She knew she had lost everything, and she had only herself to blame. Mikhailo, walking one evening with his wife, saw Elena. She was sitting on a park bench, wrapped in an old raincoat. She looked haggard, but when she saw him, her eyes sparkled with hope. "Mikhailo," she whispered, standing up. Anna looked at the man questioningly, but he just shook his head. "I want you to find your way, Elena," he said quietly but firmly. "But I'm not a part of your life anymore." He took Anna's hand, and they walked away, leaving Elena alone with her memories and the bitter realization that her choices had led her to this. A house that was once a hotbed of lies and betrayal is now filled with laughter and joy, and Olena remained in the shadow of the past, trying to survive in a world that turned its back on her.